When we think about grazing in the Great Plains and then some of the higher elevation forested systems, we know that one of the keystone grazers was present, and that's bison. And oftentimes we think about bison in prairies, but we don't consider bison as major grazers in ponderosa pine forested ecosystems, for example. So bison, when you look at their historical range, they were certainly present, and research indicates that they modified the fuel patterns and probably modified fire behavior as well. So grazing has always been a part of these forested ecosystems. And so over time, fire and grazing have interacted and have changed, and that's led to an increased density of ponderosa pine forests, which are probably more prone to catastrophic wildfire events. More recently, we have become more conservative with our grazing, to the extent of removing grazing from forested lands out of environmental concerns. And my research has shown that multiple years of excluding grazing from ponderosa pine makes that ponderosa pine stand highly susceptible to mortality if a fire should occur. And the probability that that fire will go from grass up into the canopy is very high. So multiple years of grazing exclusion can lead to catastrophic events, stand replacing wildfires in ponderosa pine. As we try to decide what to do in the future, we have to look in the rearview mirror. We have to have a hindsight view to help us determine what we should be doing. And without a doubt, Native Americans and bison were engineering the ecology, so to speak, of ponderosa pine. And we have to realize that fires maintained a lower density forest, and that grazing animals maintained a lower volume of herbaceous fuels that are where most of our fires will start. And I think that if we're going to try to not so much preserve but conserve ponderosa pine ecosystems, we have to strategically reintegrate those processes, grazing and fire. And those just aren't management decisions, those are ecological processes that we know have predated our own Euro-American thoughts about management. So, and even if it's difficult to do things like prescribed fire, we still have a goal, or rather a tool in the toolbox, and that's prescribed grazing. And my research indicates that even with conservative levels of grazing, we can reduce that risk of catastrophic events. From a wildfire management standpoint, it's a great fuel mitigation tool. And arguably, it's the only way to completely remove those fine fuels. So if we have experienced a catastrophic fire in ponderosa pine, we've lost all the mature trees, and then we have potentially planted some new ponderosa pine trees that are young and small, those trees are really at risk to dying if we get another fire that comes through. So we have to think about, when we're trying to restore those ponderosa pine stands, how do we protect those young seedlings so then they can get big enough and tolerate those fires? So using grazing in that perspective would help protect them by reducing those fine fuels. The key point when we're talking about fire and grazing in the West and the Great Plains is it's difficult to separate fire and grazing, and we try to do that, and it can go either direction. Fire can attract grazing animal, grazing can be used to reduce fire. So the relationship between fire and grazing is often one that's completely separated in the minds of managers and the public, but the reality is they complement one another, they can drive one another different directions. And so we need more research, we need more activities on the ground to understand how fire and grazing, which are ecological processes and management tools, can be used to manage plant communities. That will be beneficial for wildlife, that'll be beneficial for people in the wildland-urban interface. Those tools are so powerful, but together they may have even more synergy. So that, I think, is where we need to go.